Hello to everybody out there in our extended Montasy Comics universe. I'm Adam, and I am joined, as always, by
Yimmy.
Or maybe I'm the one who's joining Yimmy. We haven't quite figured that out. And today we are going to be talking about boxes, but not just the existence and shape and size and dimensions of boxes, but the economics of boxes, how buying boxes and how the value of boxes just comes to be, specifically as it relates to trading cards.
Yeah, and I frame it also in another way. It's, what a lot of people hear it as, hey, chicken or the egg, right? What impacts what? Meaning, are the singles that impacts the box value, or box value that impacts singles? Now, many of you, and I took a very unscientific poll, it says that singles definitely determines box value.
I don't know that it is as simple as one determining the other, but I understand why you might say that singles determines box value, because the contents of a box ultimately is just as many singles as are packaged within it.
Yep.
A box might have 5 singles in it, a box might have 240 singles in it, a box might have 1 single in it. But at the end of the day, that's what you're going to be getting.
Yep.
Most people don't buy boxes to open the packs and then just keep the packs and collect different art designs on the individual booster packs. At the same time, though, I think it's a little bit more complicated than that.
It is. I mean, and I think from a overall, as you can see, these are a whole bunch of boxes that runs through from trading card all the way to sports, right? And a lot of times, if you think of it, people usually look at what's in the checklist before deciding to buy a particular product, right? Is it worth me putting in X dollars? And therefore, that's where people begin to think, okay, maybe it is singles what determine the price.
I think the one thing that we need to look at in terms of boxes before we look at the details of what cards are in it and what specific things a person might be looking for, one of the deciding factors in terms of how value or how much value there is in something is just the overall composition. Boxes are going to vary across different types of trading card products. And one of the things that varies a lot about these boxes is just how many cards you're going to be getting inside and how much of that you're going to be accessing and you're going to be looking for. Trading card games, for example, tend to have a lot of cards in any given box. So you might have a box that has 24 packs of cards in it, 36 packs of cards in it. This is standard, and in this case, when you're buying one of those boxes, you're not just adding up the value of all of the individual singles inside. You're really paying or you're looking for a chance to get a lot of different cards at once. And I think a lot of that speaks to the function of trading card games. When you have trading card games, you're not just looking for specific cards always that you want to collect. That's definitely an incentive, and that's definitely a thing that some people look for. But a lot of folks want to use these as essentially game pieces. They're building decks, and when you do that, you want to be able to access a lot of cards very easily. So you might prioritize a particular type of box because it's not necessarily featuring one card that is a single that's especially high, because there's a high density or a high frequency of a type of card that you're really looking for.
That makes sense. But at the same time, right? So in this case, then how do you determine the value of the box?
I think that a lot of the time the value of the box is a combination of what's the highest high end, like what am I hoping to get in the best case scenario, and what's the general expected value, what am I expecting to get in the average case scenario. That is probably going to be somewhere in between that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, whether it's trading card games, or sports cards, there's always an expected ROI that people like to use, or return on investment, or what they expect to get. Now, I look at it this way. We have this product from Magic, it's called Modern Horizon 2, and then you have Baldur's Gate, right? Modern Horizons 2 came out at a price of what, $3+ or $2+ $300, right? Whereas you have the draft is usually in the $100-something range. So there are some really great cards that's being reprinted in here. But what happens if Wizards set the price at $125?
If they were to set the price at $125,
or meaning the cost to the shops, or $100 or $75, same price point as, let's say, a draft, would then the cards in there get the same value?
That is a hard thing to say definitively. I think there are two ways that could go.
Okay.
And we've seen this happen with a couple of reprint sets and special sets in the past. Sometimes what happens is if the price is relatively low, a lot more people buy these cards. The cost for people to obtain these cards, the cost of opening packs, becomes lower. As a result, you end up with a lot more of these cards that people want to play with or to collect in circulation. And as a result, the overall value of the singles goes down. And when the value of the singles goes down, the relative value or cost of the box stays in that relatively low area.
So you would say in that particular situation, let's say if the cost of Modern Horizons is the same as a regular booster draft set, then there's a great probability that the singles in there may be lower.
Yes.
And this is where there's and I do agree with that to some extent, right? Because there's initially this reprint set is created with all these cards that's determined as value X. But if it's fairly cheap and people look at it as my cost to opening versus the cards I get is worth it, they'll open a lot more of it. Right? Now that's one part of it. And when there's more of particular groups of singles in the marketplace, then the value of the cards goes down.
I can think of a couple of exceptions there, just because we see this often as time goes on. If there's one or two specific cards that happen to be exceptionally high, those cards, if that's the main factor influencing the cost of a box, because that's the one or two things that people are opening a box hoping to get, opening a greater number of boxes at a lower cost isn't always necessarily going to lead to that one specific card or those two specific cards entering the marketplace at enough of a rate to substantially alter their price, at least in the short term. So as a result, sometimes when it's a specific, very high value chase card, that could actually bring up the value of a box in the long term, rather than causing it to stay in that lower area.
That's true. And just taking a step back, we're not saying that if, let's say, Modern Horizons 2 set boosters is priced same as a regular base set boosters of, really relatively same cost, that all the cards are going to go down in price and therefore the box is going to stay that price. In fact, you can make an argument that because so many people are opening packs, there's a greater demand for the boxes, and then as a result, the box would rise, right? Because you wanted to see if you could create that balance, but eventually we'll hit that, I will call it equilibrium, hit the plateau where there's so many of these type of cards in the marketplace before it's digested that the box started going down in price.
It's funny also that we're using Baldur's Gate as an example, that we're treating it as kind of the example of a base set, because I think that with a product like this, we can actually see the exact opposite of what you were saying, which is if there's a product that is really sought after, people really want the cards in it, it's in really high demand. If it's printed at a lower price, that can still bring down the value of things. What happens when you have a product that is released at a relatively high price compared to another type of base set or compared to other products, but there are other factors that lead to it not necessarily selling as well? Let's say, for example, given where we are right now in the calendar year for Magic products, Commander Legends Battle for Baldur's Gate special product, more expensive just for folks like us to purchase to sell as retailers than a typical Magic product, significantly more expensive. However, and that's not to say that people aren't enjoying it or people haven't been picking it up, but if you compare it to other similar sets in other years, it is lower in its cost, in its price, because you have, or perhaps in addition to other things, you have a much more high value set coming out just a couple weeks later, that if people have to make a choice, if people have to lean toward something else that they might want more or might place a higher dollar value on in the short term, that can bring the cost of other products that the same people would be purchasing down, just because you can't buy everything.
Yeah, and you see that across, not just in Magic. You see that in all the other trading card games, Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh, Digimon, etc. And you also see that actually in sports, right? You could have a high value box if there isn't enough funds going around, the box may start going down in price. Or that if the singles in the box are not as valuable, it'll go down in price. But at the same time though, if you have a really high value box, so for example, you have what people look at as flawless. right? For many of you who are not familiar with Flawless, just from the look of it, look at that, it's in a briefcase. It's considered a high value card.
Yeah. You get most of the product in cards and the rest of the product in a briefcase to carry the cards.
Exactly, and there's a little key in there too.
Yep.
So, it's
really cool.
It's definitely great product, but if you get a player, let's say this is basketball, let's say if you get LeBron, base card. LeBron is very popular, versus let's say if you get a LeBron card in a regular base set hoops, there is still a huge difference in the value, right? And part of it is the cost of the box. So this is where you can make an argument that the price of a box will determine the price of the singles. It doesn't mean that they added up to be that value, but like I said, a LeBron in a base hoops versus a LeBron in Flawless is two totally different, you're not going to be able to pay the same price.
Yeah, and I think a lot of what we're talking about here in different forms is, if we wanted to use a fancy term, scarcity. Right? And I think something else to consider is not just how many people are buying something, how many people are opening something, but just how much of something exists.
Yep.
That there are products that are printed in print runs that have vastly different quantities.
Yep.
So you might have something that is printed, I'm just going to make up numbers here.
Yep.
You might have 10,000 cases in circulation versus something that has 1,000 cases in circulation. Anything that is, if it's otherwise still a desirable product, printed to such a small number is probably going to be a lot more expensive just because it's going to be that much harder to get.
True, and the word is really scarcity, right? But no matter how scarce it is, if there isn't a demand for it, then the price of the product, the price of the item will go down, right? And in case in point, what you can see is here, right? You have Top Series 2. This is what I was talking about in terms of, hey, it's a product that's fairly mainstream. You could see them in Walmart, you could see them in Walgreens, Barnes & Nobles, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the base cards are plentiful. Same player in there versus we kept this in a case form in Dynasty, which is 1 card per pack. I mean, beautiful card. The value then changes dramatically, right? That's where you're saying, this is where I will make the argument that yes, box impacts the value of the singles. But to many of you who goes, well, what happens if the rookie goes up in the box? What happens if there's higher demand in the box? Absolutely. When there is, whether it's in trading card games, whether it's in sports cards, if there are cards in there that really jumps out. And why do I say card that really jumps out? Let's say Prism, right? Prism came out, there's usually $X. Later on, it went up in price a bit more, simply because there's a particular insert that's fairly rare, but commands a huge premium. And as a result, people are buying the product. And it goes to what you're saying. Now there's greater demand for the product to get that particular card, and as a result, more of the boxes were open. The demand then drives up the price of the box. Then the box went up a little bit because the secondary market for which we have to pick them up also have gone up. And that's where the single, you see a absolute example of how the single impacts, a really quick impact to the value of the box. Now keep in mind, as everything, there's seasonality. When there's new product comes out, there's new items to chase, that's where the box or the singles correspondingly will eventually change, either lower or only increase if there's a particular card in there that drives the market.
I think something that we're looking at for all kinds of trading cards, and it's going to be very different depending on what type of trading cards we're looking at. I think what you're getting at is that they all have a life cycle, that you'll have various stages from the point when a product is first released, or even before a product is released, when a product is first solicited, up until whatever point in time you have. There's a track that things go on.
Yep.
It's not always completely predictable because there are always going to be factors that change it. But when people are looking at what's coming out, a great example, if we're going to talk about double masters, just because it's topical, that's something where a lot of folks, before even the product has released, are ordering in advance, looking at pre-orders, that the price of that we've seen just in the past couple of weeks, like just in the marketplace, has changed as they've announced what cards are going to be in the set, because that knowledge and that understanding will influence the price. When something hits, generally it'll be at a consistent amount based on that information, but then depending on the factors that we were talking about before, as things get opened, as more of particular cards enter into circulation, things might go down or might stabilize, or if there's something that happens where suddenly, oh, this card, now we want a lot more because we found if it's a trading card game, it's doing really well competitively, and we just learned this because the card just came out. Or if it's a particular player in a sports product who, their team makes the finals or something like that, that can bring things up, but you'll have that kind of, you'll have that kind of variation. Eventually you hit a point where the excitement dies down, you have as much of something in circulation as there's going to be. That comes to the end of the season, if we're talking about sports cards. It comes to the end of a format, if we're talking about certain trading card games, and things will tend to settle. But then, once the product's not being printed anymore, once the box isn't something that's being ordered in the same numbers, and you start, if you want to pick those products up, having to look at things that are already in circulation, when there aren't going to be more of them, there are only going to be less of them when it comes to sealed boxes. That's when, as the time goes on, certain boxes will start to go up, because at that point, certain cards or certain players might become things that now, oh, I know that the only way to get this particular thing is going to be in this box, and I'm not seeing it in as many places, and it's becoming a little bit harder to get. So now I might place a priority.
And that's where there's a slight, that's sort of like another topic where we started looking at it from a standpoint of, okay, scarcity based on how long it's been in there and if there's a demand for certain products. But just taking a step back, the reverse of, let's say, Modern Horizon could be seen in Series 2, baseball. When the pre-order of that came out earlier, it was significantly higher than when the checklist was actually released, because there were expectation of certain players that's going to be in there, right? So again, this is the perfect example where you're seeing where the singles influence the boxes on one end and the other end. But again, the broader way of looking at it also is, hey, what is the original cost of a particular product? Because if the cost is incredibly high, you're going to have a sort of like a floor for a particular base cards. That's why not all base cards are the same. But in the end, if you look across, whether it's trading card games, whether it's sports cards, there is that relationship that goes on where it's seasonality, it's particular performances. You could have a performance of a player. You could have how a particular card is doing in a tournament, and that will then drive up the singles, and depending on how rare the boxes are, drive up the price of the box.
Absolutely. And I think that all of these factors come together to answer a particular question. It's not the question we led with. I know often when we have a topic, we'll say, we want to talk about this today because this is a question that people often come in and they ask this, and this is the answer that we tell them. This subject and all of these factors that we've been talking about actually are the answer to a question that is so hard to answer and has so many components to it that I don't think it would have even made sense to mention it at the beginning. But I hear this all the time. They come in, especially if they're unfamiliar with certain products or learning about how the trading card world works, they'll say, what box has the most value? And that is just such a broad question and such a difficult question to answer that we always have to break it down and say, it's not really a question of a lot of value versus a little value. It's a question of, where does this price come from? That's really what we're looking at today.
Absolutely. But it's still, at the end of the day, one does drive the other. And one can argue that ultimately it is still singles, but there are other topics and there are other factors that would then influence the value of the box and thereby the singles underneath.
And with that, we are going to leave you for today. We look forward to seeing you next week or next time that we reach you in this video landscape. Thank you for joining us once again. Have a good one.
Take care.